Now that we're finished demand, we can start in on the other part of the supply and demand model, supply. So basically, a lot of this is going to mirror what we did with demand, but it's going to be about producers. So demand was all about consumers. Supply is all about producers. Um, so uh, if you're looking for a quick and easy definition of um, what supply is, it's the relationship between uh, the price of a product that it sells for and the quantity that producers are willing to supply. Um, this has a quantity supplied just like demand had quantity demanded. This is whatever specific quantity they're willing to do at whatever price. It's movement along the curve. The supply schedule is just sort of the chart version of the supply curve if you were to give the x and y coordinates, the prices and quantities of each of the spots along the curve. So the law of supply, unsurprisingly, is that price and quantity are positively related. So as price rises, quantity rises as well, meaning the slope of the curve is upward. Um, this should make sense to you. If you are a producer, you'd be willing to make more of something if it sells for a higher price. That's just you know generally good business. So that really shouldn't surprise you at all. The opposite, of course, is also true. As the price falls, the quantity will also fall. Now, in terms of the curve itself, it's also good to remind yourself that a change in supply does not mean a change in supply means a shift in the curve, and that movement along the curve is not the same thing. So as price changes, once again, if you just see price changed, that means you've moved along the curve. Quantity supply changed, but supply itself did not. If you see that supply change, if you see that phrasing where there was a change in supply, that means the curve shifted. Now, what causes the price to change? Well, it could be that the market's out of equilibrium, or it could be due to a shift in demand. We'll see that more when we do uh, our work with equilibrium a little bit later. Now, what causes the supply curve to shift? The biggest and most common one that you're going to see is a change in input price. An input price is anything that is used to produce a good or service. This includes wages. Wages are a frequent one here. So if wages went up, that means supply had to shift left. It's a decrease in supply. And remember what I said about the left and right shifts. They apply the same as demand did. So a left shift is a decrease in supply. A rightward shift is an increase in supply. Remember, always do left and right, not up and down. So left decrease, right increase. So what's being illustrated here on this slide is a decrease in supply if you go from S1 to S2. So an increase in input prices kind of understandably means that firms will be able to produce less, so supply decreases. If you have a decrease in input prices, then firms will be able to produce more because it becomes relatively cheaper for them to produce. So supply would shift right in that case. Related goods and services, just like demand had related goods and services, supply has related goods and services. This shows up a lot less frequently on the AP test because it gets a little bit more confusing with the wording, as you'll see in just a second. So a related good in supply has to do with the production itself. So you don't have to work. It's not about do you use it in place of. It's can you produce it in place of. So it's making materials from the same raw goods. So gasoline and heating oil is one of them. We'll go through a few more examples. But the idea of the quantity produced of one really depends on the quantity produced and the price of the other. The two types of related goods for supply are once again called substitutes and complements, but they will always say in production afterwards. It's an important part of that. It's always in production. So if you have a substitute in production, that means that these are two things that you can choose to produce. So the best example here is always you have wood, you have timber or something, and you can choose to make two types of goods with that timber. You can make baseball bats or 2x4s. So if you're making baseball bats and 2x4s, that's your choice. If you make more baseball bats, well, then you can't make more 2x4s because you use the same raw material. So for this case, think of yourself as a producer. You would rather produce the more expensive one. So the rise in price of one good means a fall in supply of the other. The opposite is also true. If you have the price fall of one good, it will increase supply of the other because it's become relatively more expensive. Um, so in this case, if we want to get once again talked about baseball bats and 2x4s, if the price of baseball bats rose, then the supply of 2x4s would decrease, and you'd get what's illustrated here on the graph. Complements in production are a little bit trickier. This is when you produce something as a byproduct of producing some other good. This doesn't come up a whole lot. This is very uncommon to show up in the AP test. But basically, the most common example of this is sawdust, which sounds silly. But the basic idea is whenever you produce something made of wood, sawdust comes out. It's just a natural byproduct. And that sawdust can actually be used to make many other things. One of the most notable is particle board. You can take it and you can press that sawdust together and you produce particle board. So for a complement in production of as the price increases of one, supply of the other increases as well, which should make sense. You're producing more of something, so you get more of the byproduct. The opposite is true as well. So once again, if we're thinking back to our wood example, the price of baseball bats rose, then you have the supply of sawdust rising as well. Like I said, these don't show up too often, and it will always say in production afterwards. If it just says substitute or complement, that means it's demand. But always look for in production afterwards. Changes in technology, I think this one's pretty easy to understand. It's just the idea that when you have better technology, you can produce more. You have better machines, your supply increases. If for some reason all of your machinery is destroyed, well, then you'd have a leftward shift in supply. Changes in expectations. This has to do with if you think the price will increase or decrease in the future of the product. You might restrict production in order to produce more later. Artificially hold it back. One of the best examples of this is gas in the summer. So right before summertime rolls around, you have firms holding back their production because they're anticipating everybody getting in their cars and driving a lot. They're anticipating that price rise in the summer. So supply decreases just before the summer and then increases once the summer starts. This shows up extremely rarely. It's one of the most rare things to show up in terms of supply and demand shifts and should be made fairly obvious in the actual question itself. It should say supply was restricted or something like that to fully tell you what was happening. One of the more easy ones and one of the ones that will actually come up frequently when we do market structures is changes in number of producers. Because just like in demand, where we all had our individual demand curves, supply is the same thing. There's a lot of individual suppliers, and you add those together, and they become the market supply curve. So if you have a change in your number of producers, your market supply curve will shift. If firms leave the market, supply shifts left. If firms enter the market, supply shifts right. And that's all we have for supply.